Okay, we are live. Let me see if this thing will work. Check one, two, check. Yes, it's working. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I'm going to read from a book called Panzer Leader by Heinz Guderian. If you're into military history, you probably know his name. He is very well known as one of the captains of the invasion of Russia. So I'm going to read a chapter titled The Campaign in Russia, but contextualize it in today because it ended up being just a catastrophe for the German people. Really, Hitler led him into a brutal, vicious war. And by 1945, the Russians were in Berlin, and the U.S. had already made a landing, and they had a two-front war that they didn't expect. So there were all these challenges that cascaded from this crazy decision by Hitler, who's a maniac, drugged out. And this Panzer Leader was published in 52. Guderian died in 54, but he was also known for being an exponent of armored columns, right? Armored warfare, and kind of made his name for that. So he had a book before this in the 30s called Octone Panzer, but his memoirs, there's a lot of contentions about how honest he was. I don't think anybody who writes a memoir is really that honest, honestly. But he left out some of the stuff, some of the orders that Hitler gave to kill political Marxists on the spot were minimized and ignored in some of these other orders. But Guderian was interesting. He knew kind of a lot of other Western strategists. So the intro to Panzer Leader was written by B.H. Liddell Hart, a very well-known military historian, very influential, wrote like 40 books or something like that. But he also Guderian mentions in Panzer Leader that he read J.F.C. Fuller, right? That's one of Crowley's acolytes and followers, lifelong friend of Crowley, really. And they were personal between the interwar period. They were known to each other. They had met each other, Guderian and Fuller. So the reason that I'm reading this, it probably seems maybe a curveball, but it's very salient because the U.S., like this crazy person who's running our government. I mean, I don't even know if he's obviously not mentally fit for the job. Like any respectable party group with integrity would already have let him go, to a rest home or something like that, or go play shuffleboard in Palm Springs or something like that. So we're way past that. That these people are so venal and vulgar and evil. Really, they're really evil to let this guy captain us into a crazy war. Like they just had a bombing in Crimea. It's probably not covered on the boob tube, the idiot box, the hypno program box. If you're still watching TV, you're an idiot. But it's covered on the other media where they had this new bomb, they okayed a strike, and they killed two kids at a beach on a sunny day, sunning themselves on Crimea. It's so sick. It's so evil and twisted. Like that's just the beginning. And I mean, we can count how many 500,000 dead. They don't even care about the 500,000 dead in Ukraine. They have some weird fixation that they've turned Putin into a caricature, just like they did Trump. That's all their thing. Like it's almost like this preceding thing before they try to destroy somebody is like turn them into a buffoon or a Nazi or some kind of ridiculous cartoonish character, which they've done with Putin. And all these people in the Democratic Party are stupid as hell. They are so stupid that they will lead us into a catastrophic war. We're already at the brink of financial catastrophe, but they will lead us into this stupid war. Nobody should fight the Russians. I mean, we have so many more battles to fight other than that, but they're just protecting their border. That was the whole thing. It was a slow encroachment, all the stuff that Ukraine's a democracy. That's slop for stupid people. They installed Zelensky. They've shut down the vote. He's actually in there against the law. So these are criminals. These are people encouraging criminality. But I want to play this one video from Joe Rogan. This is Joe Rogan talking with Jimmy Dore from, I think, today. This was just published today. So let's see if I can get it.
Is keep the people distracted and divided. That's always been the playbook. And then while we're in the middle of these international conflicts that are baffling to everybody involved, and you're wondering how they have all this money to do that, but they don't have any money to address all the problems that we have. How about the people in Maui? Imagine being a person in
Could
Maui
you
that lost
imagine
their
that-
home. They give you $700, and then you still can't rebuild. It's a year later, nothing's been built.
And at the blink of an eye, they give $100 billion to Zelensky, and
Well, even worse, they accidentally sent Ukraine $6 billion. They sent an accidental $6 billion. So then we looked up, like, how much would it cost to rebuild every house that got destroyed in the fire? $5 billion. So they could have
so
done
why
that.
wouldn't they do that?
Why wouldn't they do that?
do you
Why
thi-
wouldn't they do that? I don't understand. Those people are devastated. And then there's all this talk
You know,
about like
you go to
taking over that land and
Well, you go to Maui. I was in Maui, and you see people have put graffiti on the side of buildings saying this is a land grab.
yeah.
You see that a lot.
It is a land grab. It's a pretty transparent land grab.
Right.
It's happening in front of our eyes, and no one's doing anything about it because it's 5 hours in a jet across the ocean. And we're watching this shit take place where these people, and first of all, just horrible mismanagement of water rights, horrible mismanagement of power lines. The fact that they have horrible winds, crazy winds there, and they've had these fucking power lines that are above ground. When I lived in California, my fucking lines were underground. They figured it out there. How come they didn't figure it out in Hawaii? You know how much money could have been saved? They just put the power lines underground.
It was so unfortunate that their alarm system malfunctioned.
Yeah, how about that?
And that the water got turned off, so the firefighters.
They wouldn't let them turn the water on.
It was
people. The water's a very valuable commodity there. The whole thing is fucking insane.
And that the cops are turning people back into the fire. It's just these
The
are
whole
all,
thing is insane.
These are all just unfortunate. It's unfortunate things.
Yeah, it's such a joke. Like I mean, it's the worst administration in American history. There's no question about it. On almost every issue, they've bungled, blown it, and they're about to get us all killed. So, I mean, it's the same thing that happened in Germany, right? You're totally propagandized. You're totally lied to. Everything's fake. And you don't even know the consequences of what some of these leaders are doing. And that's what's interesting about Guderian. It's really a first-person watcher in all of these events. But, you know, like anything, autobiography, you got to take with a grain of salt. And there's a lot of issues of stuff that he was involved in, how much of a Nazi he was. He was appointed after they tried to kill Hitler in June of 1944. He was appointed by Hitler to kind of oversee the prosecution of the conspirators, right? Von Stauffenberg and all these other characters. This is in that movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise. So he was involved in that, and there's issues of like, was he involved in the actual conspiracy, or did he know that they were going to try to take out Hitler? Because he like went on a vacation on the day that it happened. So there's a lot of whispers in the military too about taking care of Hitler, getting rid of him. But you're going to see in this chapter, there's a lot of talk about Hitler's physical. Like this is playing. That's why this book is timely for today. They knew Hitler was a junkie. He was really gacked. Like that's a modern term of somebody who is a garbage head, just taking tons of drugs. And Guderian says in 1941, Hitler was already showing signs of physical decline, which is manifested very few times. There's a couple videos of him right at the end in 1945 where he has an uncontrollable shake to one of his hands on his left. And there's other people who saw Hitler after the bombing. And he didn't show any pain because he had tons of opiates in his body. But yeah, so Guderian sees this firsthand. Hitler's doctor is Morel. But yeah, this is what's happening now. Like you have people who shouldn't leave. We have a total leadership crisis. I don't even think Trump's that great. It's not it's a much larger issue than some simple binary, you know? It really is. So you guys should all pray because, I mean, people who know history knows this bad. So anyway, I'm going to read from this book. If you guys want to read along, I can actually just put this up. People just send me something like, do they want to just listen to this? Do they want to see the book? You know, let me know. Send me an email. WilliamRamseyInvestigates@gmail.com. Also, I just finished my second edition of the Smiley Face Killers book. So the Kindle is the new edition. The paperback probably would be okayed on Monday. They just have to approve the kind of the cover that I did. But I added 50 new pages, fixed a lot of the editorial stuff. Like I do all this stuff myself. I don't hire an outside person, so it takes a little longer. I don't really have its team or anything. But yeah, so you can see that on Amazon, or you can buy the book from me, the new book, through my website, William Ramsey Investigates, or you can go to Patreon. I have some videos and things like that. But things that are pertaining to the smiley face killers and all my other shows you can listen to on Patreon without ads. You don't have to be bothered by ads. So that's an option for you. People have wanted that option. You can also support my my podcast. I think you can pay $5 a month through Spreaker. I got a new host. So I've been kind of rotating some old shows, fixing them up, equalizing the thing. But yeah, Otto Reamer was dupe. Yeah, he was a hero of the Order of Nine Angles, Reamer was. But that's a whole nother show. I'm reading this to put it into context of today and the catastrophe that really befell the German people. I mean, imagine some of these people who were like hated the Nazi regime, but like were in these, got bombed by Allied forces, like just got captured in this whole thing. Like they're not even on board. And just these crazy decisions. Some of the most savage fighting in human history was in the Eastern Front, or was between Germany and Russia. And we're kind of at that precipice right now. So if you don't see that or understand that, I pity you. I mean, I think you gotta find some of these alternate guys. I've been listening to Judging Freedom with Andrew Napolitano. His guests are all very intelligent, well-read, understand history, understand geopolitics. And I suggest you check those out because I think they have a better understanding of these buffoons on TV. They're wasting your time. They're polluting your brain. They're all part of the party. They all turned on Biden at the same time after like, oh my God, we just realized he's really in bad shape. Like they knew he was in bad shape 4 years ago. They're just all liars. That's really one of the big problems is like the moral depravity of the American people in toto, that they even tolerate somebody who's their leader who just lies constantly. Because that's all the left really does is lie. I'm not saying the right's that much better. They lied about everything. Anyway, this book is important in context because it's going to happen. I mean, I'm telling you right now that the U.S. on the financial portion alone cannot sustain itself. So once this gets corrected, you're going to be back in World War I Germany with massive inflation, and your paper that you work for and your 401k isn't worth squat. They're going to need somebody to fix it, and it's not going to be Joe Biden. It's not going to be any of these losers from the left. Their solution is just to parasite off of you and take as much money, and the government's really just a big, scam where they just take all the stuff and run it to their friends and run their own businesses, sell you out. Anyway, this book's really interesting. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Chapter 6, Campaign in Russia, 1941. This is the translation, right, from German. The background, preparations, opening operations, crossing the Dnieper, Smolensk, Elnya, Roslav, Moscow, or Kiev. The Battle of Kiev. The battles of Orel and Bryansk. Advanced to Tula and Moscow from my first dismissal, right? So he gets dismissed. On May 3rd, 1939, Molotov had been appointed Soviet Foreign Commissar in place of Litvinov. He played a prominent part in negotiating the non-aggression pact with Germany of August 3rd, 1939, which enabled Hitler to attack Poland. The Russians helped in the destruction of Poland by invading the eastern portions of that country on September 18th, 1939. On September 29, 1939, Russia signed a pact of friendship with Germany and at the same time made a trade agreement that was to be of considerable value to the Germans in the economic prosecution of the war. Meanwhile, the Russians also made the most of the international situation. They seized the Baltic states and on the 30th of November, 1939, launched an attack on Finland. While Germany's armed forces were occupied in the west, the Russians compelled the Romanians to surrender Bessarabia. As a result of this move, Hitler, on the 30th of August, 1940, felt himself bound to guarantee Romania's independence. In October of 1940, Hitler had discussions with French leaders and with Franco concerning the future course of the war. In connection with these conversations, he next went to meet his friend Mussolini in Florence. It was while on his way to this meeting on Bologna Station, to be exact, that he learned, to his surprise, of his allies' declaration of a private war against Greece. This had been done without Hitler's connivance, and he did not approve of it. By this act of Mussolini's, the Balkan problem was reopened and the war took a new direction, which, for Germany at least, was highly undesirable. The first result of Mussolini's arbitrary gesture, according to what Hitler told me, was that Franco immediately withdrew from any sort of collaboration with the Axis powers. He plainly had no intention of becoming involved in a common policy with such unpredictable partners. The next sequel was increasing tension between Germany and the Soviet Union. Such tension already existed as a result of a number of incidents that had occurred during the past few months, mainly in connection with German policy in Romania and on the Danube. It was to lessen this that Molotov was invited to Berlin. In Berlin, Molotov made the following claims. 1. Finland was to be regarded as belonging within the Soviet sphere of interest. 2. An agreement was made concerning the future of Poland. 3. Soviet interest in Romania and Bulgaria must be recognized. 4. Soviet interests in the Dardanelles must also be acknowledged. After Molotov had returned to Moscow, the Russians restated these demands in more precise form in writing. Hitler was highly incensed by the Russian claims and expressed his displeasure at length during the Berlin conversations, while simply ignoring the subsequent Russian note. The conclusions he drew from Molotov's visit and its results was a belief that war with the Soviet Union must sooner or later be inevitable. He was to describe to me repeatedly the course that the Berlin conference took. I have given his version here. It is true that he never talked to me about this matter before 1943, but later on he did so several times and always in exactly the same terms. I have no reason to believe that what he said to me was not a repetition of his opinions at the time in question. Angered as he was by the Russian claims, he expressed his annoyance with the Italian policy of October 1940 in even stronger words. From his point of view, he was, I think, quite right to do so. The Italian attack on Greece was as fatuous in execution as it was unnecessary in design. The Italian offensive had already been brought to a halt by the 30th of October. On the 6th of November, the initiative passed to the Greeks. As is usually the ease when bad policy results in military catastrophe, Mussolini turned in anger against his generals, and in particular against Badoglio, who had warned him against bellicose escapades, though unfortunately in vain. In the middle of November, the Italians suffered a sharp defeat. Badoglio was therefore an enemy of the regime and a traitor. On the 26th of November, he tendered his resignation. On December 6th, Cavaliero was appointed to succeed him. On December 10th, the Italians were heavily defeated in North Africa near Sidi Barani. It would have been more in the common interest of Germany and Italy to desist from the Greek adventure in its place to strengthen the position in North Africa. Now Marshal Graziani began asking for German aeroplanes. Mussolini decided to request the dispatch to Libya of 2 German panzer divisions. During the course of the winter, Bardia, Derna, and Tobruk were lost. Rommel's German troops finally put the situation in order once again. Italy's uncoordinated action and mistakes in the Balkans resulted in strong German forces being committed in Africa and Bulgaria, and subsequently in Greece and Serbia. This led to a weakening of our strength in the decisive theaters of the war. It had now been shown that the principle by which the Alps were accepted as the boundary between the spheres of interest of the Axis powers was quite inapplicable to the real needs of wartime leadership. Cooperation between the two allies was so faulty that it might just as well not have existed at all. Shortly after Molotov's visit, my new chief of staff, Lieutenant Colonel Freiherr von Liebenstein, and my first general staff officer, Major Bayerlein, were summoned to a conference by the chief of the Army General Staff. There they heard for the first time about the proposed campaign against Soviet Russia, Operation Barbarossa. They returned from this conference and reported to me. When they spread out a map of Russia before me, I could scarcely believe my eyes. Was something which I had held to be utterly impossible now to become a fact? Hitler had criticized the leaders of German policy of 1914 in the strongest possible words for their failure to avoid a war on 2 fronts. Was he now, on his own initiative and before the war with England had been decided, to open the Second Front War against the Russians? All his soldiers had warned him repeatedly and urgently against this very error, which he himself agreed with them. And he himself agreed with them. I made no attempt to conceal my disappointment and disgust. My 2 staff officers, who had been entirely convinced by the arguments put forth by the OKH, were surprised by the vehemence of my language. They explained to me how the chief of the Army General Staff, Halder, had calculated that Russia would be defeated in a campaign of 8 to 10 weeks' duration. 3 army groups, each approximately the same strength, were to attack with diverging objectives. No single clear operational objective seemed to be envisaged. envisaged. Looked at from a professional point of view, this did not appear at all promising. I arranged for my chief of staff to convey my views to the OKH, where they produced absolutely no effect. As one of the uninitiated, I could only now hope that Hitler was not seriously planning an attack on the Soviet Union, and that all these preparations were a bluff. The winter and spring of 1941 passed as in a nightmare. Renewed study of the campaigns of Charles XII of Sweden and of Napoleon clearly revealed all the difficulties of the theater to which we threatened to be committed. It also became increasingly plain to see how inadequate were our preparations for so enormous an undertaking. Our success to date, however, and in particular the surprising speed of our victory in the West, had so befuddled the minds of our supreme commanders that they had eliminated the word impossible from their vocabulary. All the men of the OKW and the OKH with whom I spoke evinced an unshakable optimism and were quite impervious to criticism or objections. Seems familiar. In view of the heavy task that lay ahead, I concentrated with especial energy on the training and equipping of the divisions for which I was responsible. I made it quite clear to my troops that the campaign ahead of them would be a far more difficult one than those of which they had fought in Poland and the West. For security reasons, I could not be more specific. I wanted, however, to make sure that my soldiers did not embark on this new and infinitely difficult task in a spirit of frivolity. Unfortunately, most of the vehicles of the new divisions which Hitler had ordered to be set up were, as already stated, French. This equipment was in no way capable of meeting the demands of warfare in Eastern Europe. German vehicle production was insufficient to meet our greatly increased requirements. We could not, therefore, replace the palpably inferior captured vehicles with German ones. The decrease in strength of the tank element within the Panzer division has already been mentioned. The smaller number of tanks per division was compensated for, to a certain extent, by the fact that the old Panzers 1 and 2 had been almost completely replaced by Panzers 3 and 4. We believed at the beginning of the new war we could reckon our tanks being technically better than all known Russian types. We thought that this would be more or less cancel out the Russians' vast numerical superiority. For when the campaign opened, our tank strength amounted only to some 3,200 units. But one curious incident made me at least slightly dubious concerning the relative superiority of our armored equipment. In the spring of 1941, Hitler had specifically ordered that a Russian military commission be shown over our tank schools and factories. In this order, he had insisted that nothing be concealed from them. The Russian officers in question firmly refused to believe that the Panzer IV was in fact our heaviest tank. They said repeatedly that we must be hiding our newest models from them and complained that we were not carrying out Hitler's order to show them everything. The military commission was so insistent on this point that eventually our manufacturers and ordnance office officials concluded, it seems that the Russians must already possess better and heavier tanks than we do. It was at the end of July 1941 that the T-34 tank appeared at the front, and the riddle of the new Russian model was solved. Hitler attended a demonstration of armored equipment on the 18th of April, at which I was present. It was on this occasion that he noticed that the Panzer III had been re-equipped by the Army Ordnance Office with a 50mm L-42 cannon, instead of with a 50mm L-60 as he had ordered. This independent act on the part of the Ordnance Office infuriated him all the more, since it involved a weakening of his original intentions. At this time, our yearly tank production scarcely amounted to more than 1,000 of all types. In view of our enemy's production figures, this was very small. As far back as 1933, I had visited a single Russian tank factory, which was producing 22 tanks per day at the Christie-Ruski type. On March 1st, Bulgaria joined the Triple Alliance, and on March 25th, Yugoslavia followed suit. However, on March 27th, a coup d'etat in Belgrade upset the Axis plans. On April 5th, Russia and Yugoslavia signed a pact of friendship. On April 6th, the Balkan campaign began. I took no part in this. The Panzer troops engaged proved themselves once again and contributed greatly to our rapid victory. Only one man was pleased by this new extension of the theater of war, Mussolini. This was his own war, on which he had embarked without Hitler's permission. However, the pact of friendship signed between Russia and Yugoslavia made it clear to us that we were heading for trouble with our powerful eastern neighbor, and the smash could not be long delayed. Belgrade fell on April 13th. On April 17th, the Yugoslav army surrendered. The Greek army did likewise on April 23rd, despite British assistance. At the end of May, airborne troops made possible the capture of Crete though unfortunately not of Malta. Germany, Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Albania all took slices of Yugoslav territory. An independent state of Croatia was formed. Its king was to be the Italian Duke of Spoleto, and he never sat on his rather shaky throne. In accordance with the request of the King of Italy, Montenegro was also reconstituted as an independent state. Since the frontiers of the newly created Croatia did not correspond to ethnological borders of that nation, there was from the very beginning constant friction with the Italians. Bitter disagreements further poisoned the atmosphere in this already turbulent corner of Europe. In May and June of 1941, the British succeeded in occupying Syria and Abyssinia. A German attempt to secure a foothold in Iraq was carried out with insufficient force and failed. It could only have succeeded if it had been part of the logical and sensible Mediterranean policy which we could and should have adopted in the summer of 1940. By now, it was too late for isolated actions of this type. Preparations. The Balkan campaign had been concluded with all the speed desired, and the troops there engaged, which were now needed for Russia, were withdrawn according to plan and very fast. But all the same, there was a definite delay in the opening of our Russian campaign. Furthermore, we had a very wet spring. The Bug and its tributaries were at flood level until well into May, and the nearby ground was swampy and almost impassable. I was in a position personally to observe this during my tours of inspection in Poland. 3 army groups were formed for the attack on Soviet Russia. Army Group South under Field Marshal von Rundstedt to the south of the Pripyat marshes. Army Group Center under Field Marshal von Bock between the Pripyat marshes and Suwalki Peak. Army Group North under Field Marshal Ritter von Lieb in East Prussia. The intention was that these 3 army groups should break through the Russian forces stationed near the frontier, then encircle and destroy them. The panzer groups were to push forward deep into Russia and thus prevent the forming of new defensive fronts. No area of main effort was laid down. The 3 army groups were of approximately equal strength, although Army Group Center had 2 panzer groups allotted to it, while Army Group South and North had only 1 each. I commanded Panzer Group 2. General Hoth, immediately to my north, had Panzer Group 3. These were the 2 groups subordinated to Army Group Center. My Panzer Group was assigned the following task. On the first day of the offensive, it was to cross the Bug on either side of Brest-Litovsk. It was to break through the Russian defensive positions. Then it was quickly to exploit the success gained and advance to the area of Roslav, Elnya, Smolensk. The intention was to prevent the enemy from regrouping and forming a new front, thus to lay the groundwork for a decisive victory during the 1941 campaign. My Panzer Group was to receive further instructions when its objective had been reached. Preliminary orders as issued by the OKH indicated that the plan was then probably to switch Haas' 3rd and my 2nd Panzer Groups due north to capture Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. The border between the German-controlled general government of Poland and the Soviet-Russian zone was the river Bug. It was the fortress of Brest-Litovsk. Thus, the fortress of Brest-Litovsk was split, the citadel being occupied by the Russians. Only the old forts on the West Bank were in German hands. I had already captured the fortress once during the Polish campaign. I now had the same task to perform a second time, though in more difficult circumstances. Despite the very plain lessons of the Western campaign, the Supreme German Command did not hold uniform views about the employment of armored forces. This became evident during the various war games that were held in preparation for the operation and for the purpose of training the commanders for their missions. The generals who came from arms of the service other than the panzer troops were inclined to the opinion that the initial assault should be made by infantry divisions after heavy artillery preparation, and that the tank should only be sent in to complete the breakthrough after penetration to a specified depth had been made. The panzer generals held the contrary view. They wanted the panzer divisions to be in the forefront of the attack from the very beginning, because they regarded their arm as the most powerful attacking weapon. They expected the armor would thus achieve a deep and rapid breakthrough, which initial success could be immediately exploited by the tank speed of advance. The panzer generals knew from experience in France what happens when the other system is employed. At the critical moment of success, the roads are covered with the endless, slow-moving, horse-drawn columns of the infantry divisions, and the panzers, as a result, are blocked and slowed up. so they wished the panzer divisions to be put in front of those sectors where a breakthrough was desired. On other sectors where the tasks were different, as for example in the storming of fortresses, the infantry should lead the assault. This situation arose in the sector of Panzer Group II's attack. The fortifications of Brest-Litovsk were out of date, it is true, but the combination of the Bug, the Mukievek, and water-filled ditches made them immune to tank attack. Tanks could only have captured the citadel by means of a surprise attack, as had been attempted in 1939. The requisite conditions for such an attack did not exist in 1941. I therefore decided to attack with my panzer divisions across the Bug on either side of Brest-Litovsk, and I asked for that an infantry corps be placed under my command for the assault on the fortress. This corps would have to come from the Fourth Army, which was to follow behind my panzer group. The Fourth Army would also have to provide further infantry to assist in the initial river crossings, as well as a considerable amount of artillery support. In order to ensure unity of command, I asked that these troops be temporarily subordinated to me, and expressed my willingness to place myself under the command of Fourth Army's commander, Field Marshal von Kluge, during this time. These command arrangements proved acceptable to the Army group. They involved a sacrifice on my part. Field Marshal von Kluge was a hard man to work under, but I held them to be important for the success of the undertaking. The area for the attack was bound on the front by the river Bug. Our first task was to secure crossings in the face of the enemy. This would be much easier if some degree of surprise could be obtained. I could not reckon on an immediate capture of the fortress of Brest-Litovsk, so my attacking armor would initially be split into two. I had therefore to ensure that my group did not suffer in consequence of this, and also to secure the two open flanks of the panzer group. Once the Bug was crossed, the right wing of the group would be advancing along the edge of Pripet marshes, which are impassable to vehicles and very heavy going on foot. Weak infantry forces of Fourth Army were to move through them. To the left of the panzer group, there would be elements of Fourth Army attacking, and beyond it, the infantry of the Ninth Army. It was this left flank which was particularly threatened, since strong Soviet forces were known to be massing in the Bialystok area. It must be assumed that once these forces were aware of the danger to their rear from our panzer divisions, they would attempt to extricate themselves from encirclement along the line of the main road, Volkovisk-Slonim. This double threat to the flanks was parried by two countermeasures. A, through arranging our forces in depth, particularly on the more dangerously threatened left flank, and B, by sending the Panzer Group's 1st Cavalry Division through the marshes on our right, which were well nigh impassable to motorized formations. Further security was provided by the Fourth Army's infantry divisions advancing behind the Panzer Group and by widespread air reconnaissance. On June 6th, the Chief of the Army General Staff paid a visit to the Panzer Group. He expressed an opinion that in order to be in fit condition for performing their principal task of thrusting deep into the enemy's defenses, the panzer divisions should be kept back during the initial phase, while infantry divisions carried out the first assault. I could not agree to this alteration to the plan. I received at my headquarters only bare indications of the Supreme Command's intentions for the second phase of the operation after the first objectives, in my case of my corps in the area, Roslav, Elnya, Smolensk, had been reached. These envisioned first of all the capture of Leningrad and the Baltic coast, so that contact might be established with the Finns and the Army Group North safely supplied by sea. A proof that such plans were being seriously studied is supplied by the operational instructions which were issued. In it, it was stated that General Haas' 3rd Panzer Group, and possibly also my group, were to halt in the Smolensk area and prepare to swing north in support of the operations of Army Group North. This operation would have had one great advantage. It would once and for all have secured the left wing of the German armies fighting in Russia. In my opinion, this was the best plan that could have been devised in the circumstances. But unfortunately, I never heard anything more about it. On June 14th, Hitler assembled all of the commanders of army groups, armies, and panzer groups in Berlin in order to explain his reasons for attacking Russia and to receive final reports on the preparations that had been made. He spoke on the following lines. He could not defeat England. Therefore, in order to bring the war to a close, he must win a complete victory on the continent. Germany's position on the mainland would only be unassailable when Russia had been defeated. His detailed exposition for the reasons that led him to fight a preventive war against the Russians was unconvincing. The tension that had arisen as a result of German penetration of the Balkans, the intervention of the Russians in Finland, the occupation of the Baltic states, such were the political reasons. These were as insufficient causes for taking a resolve of such drastic dimensions as were the ideological theories of the National Socialist dogma and certain reports of preparations for attack on the part of the Russians that had come in. As long as the war in the West was still undecided, any new undertaking must result in a war on two fronts. And Adolf Hitler's Germany was even less capable of fighting such a war than had been the Germany of 1914. The assembled company listened to Hitler's speech in silence, and then, since there was to be no discussion, dispersed still in silence and with heavy hearts. During the afternoon at the military conference concerning the preparations that had been made, I was asked only one question. How long would it take me to reach Minsk? I replied 5 to 6 days. The attack began on the 22nd of June and arrived at Minsk on the 27th, while Hoff, advancing from Suwalki, had already occupied that city from the north on the 26th. Before I turn to describing the operations of my Panzer Group, I should like to outline the general situation of the German army at the beginning of this decisive campaign in Russia. According to the information available to me, the German army on the 22nd of June, 1941, consisted of 205 divisions, 38 divisions in the West, 12 divisions in Norway, 1 division in Denmark, 7 divisions in the Balkans, 2 divisions in Libya, and therefore 145 divisions available for operations in the East. This dispersal of strength involved an unpleasant dissipation. The figure of 38 divisions in the West appeared particularly high. 12 divisions for Norway also formed an unnecessarily large garrison. A consequence of the Balkan campaign was that the Russian offensive could not be launched until late in the summer. Far more significant, however, than either of these facts was the underestimate of the Russian as an enemy. Our outstanding military attaché in Moscow, General Kostring, had reported on the military strength of that gigantic country. Hitler attached as little importance to these reports as he did to others concerning the production capacity of Russian industry or the stability of the Russian political system. On the contrary, he had succeeded in infecting his immediate military entourage with his own baseless optimism. The OKW and the OKH were so serenely confident of victory before winter set in that winter clothing had only been prepared for every fifth man in the army. It was not until August 30th, 1941, that the OKH had become seriously concerned with the problem of supplying major portions of the army with winter clothing. On this day, an entry made by an OKH diary reads, "In view of recent deployments which are likely to necessitate operations against limited objectives even during the winter, the operations department will draft a report on the winter clothing that will be required for this purpose. After approval by the Chief of the Army General Staff, this report will be passed to the Organization Department for necessary action." It is frequently maintained nowadays that Hitler and only Hitler was responsible for the lack of winter clothing in the army of 1941. I can in no way subscribe to this belief. Proof of this is that the Luftwaffe and the Waffen-SS were well and adequately equipped and had laid in the necessary stocks in plenty of time. But the Supreme Command was sunk in its dream of defeating the Russian army in 8 or 10 weeks. This defeat would result, they thought, in the political collapse of the Soviets. So confident were they of this that in the autumn of 1941, a considerable portion of Germany's industry was switched from war production to other purposes. It was even proposed to move 60 to 80 of the divisions in the East back to Germany at the beginning of winter. What remained would suffice to control Russia until spring came. Those remaining divisions were to occupy comfortable quarters in a well-prepared defensive line to be built during the autumn. It all seemed to be very well thought out and delightfully simple. A description of events as they occurred will show how far these ideas were divorced from the cruel reality. Finally, an allusion must be made to an event which was to leave a deep stain on Germany's reputation. Shortly before the opening of hostilities, the OKW sent an order direct to all corps and divisions concerning the treatment that was to be given to the civilian population and to prisoners of war in Russia. It specified that in the event of excesses being committed against civilians or prisoners, the responsible soldier was not automatically to be tried and punished according to military law. Disciplinary action was only to be taken at the discretion of the man's immediate unit commander. This order was obviously likely to have the most unfortunate effect on the preservation of discipline. The commander-in-chief of the army had apparently realized this himself, for an appendix to the order signed by Field Marshal von Brauchitsch stated that the order would be only carried out if there was no danger of discipline suffering thereby. Since both I and my corps commanders were immediately convinced that discipline must suffer if the order were published, I forbade its forwarding to the divisions and ordered that it be returned to Berlin. This order, which was to play an important part in the post-war trials of German generals by our former enemies, was consequently never carried out in my Panzer group. At the time, I dutifully informed my commander-in-chief of the army group that I was not publishing or obeying this order. The equally notorious so-called Commissar order never even reached my Panzer group. No doubt Army Group Center had already decided not to forward it. Therefore, the Commissar order was never carried out by my troops either. Looking back, one can only deeply regret that neither the OKW or the OKH blocked these two orders in the first place. Many brave and innocent soldiers would have thus been saved bitter suffering, and the good name of Germany would have been spared a great shame, regardless of whether the Russians had signed the Hague Agreement or not. Whether or not they had approved the Geneva Convention, German soldiers must accept their international obligations and must behave according to the dictates of a Christian conscience. Even without harsh orders, the effects of war on a population of an enemy country are cruel enough, and the Russian civilians were as innocent of causing this war as were our own. I'll repeat that sentence. Even without harsh orders, of the effects of war on the population of an enemy country are cruel enough, and the Russian civilians were as innocent of causing this war as were our own. Opening operations. In describing the events which now took place, I have in places given an exact description of how my time was spent. I've done this in order to show the spiritual and physical demands that were made on the commander of a panzer group during the Russian campaign. After Hitler's speech to the generals on June 14th, I flew to Warsaw on the 15th, where my staff was quartered. The days until the opening of the attack on June 22nd, I spent visiting the troops and their jumping off places and also the neighboring units in order to ensure full cooperation. The march to the assembly areas and the final preparations for the attack passed smoothly enough. On June 17th, I examined the course of the River Bug, which was our front line. On the 19th, I visited General von Mackensen's 3rd Army Corps, which was immediately to the right of my panzer group. On the 20th and 21st, I visited the forward units of my corps to make sure that all preparations for the attack were satisfactorily completed. Detailed study of the behavior of the Russians convinced me that they knew nothing of our intentions. We had observation of the courtyard of Brest-Litovsk citadel and could see them drilling by platoons to the music of a military band. The strong points along their bank of the Bug were unoccupied. They had made scarcely any noticeable progress in strengthening their fortified positions during the past few weeks. So the prospects of our attack achieving surprise were good, and the question therefore arose whether the 1 hour's artillery preparation, which had been planned, was now necessary after all. I finally decided not to cancel it. This was simply a precaution lest unexpected Russian countermeasures cause us unavoidable casualties. On the fateful day of June 22nd, 1941, I went on at 02:10 hours to my group command post, which was located in an observation tower south of Bohukali, 9 miles northwest of Brest-Litovsk. It was still dark when I arrived there. At 03:15 hours, our artillery opened up. At 03:40 hours, the first dive bomber attack went in. At 04:15 hours advance, units of the 17th and the 18th Panzer Divisions began to cross the Bug. At 0400 hours, the leading tanks of the 18th Panzer Division forded the river. For this, they were equipped with waterproofing, which had been tested for Operation Sea Lion, which enabled them to move through 13 feet of water. At 0650 hours, I crossed the Bug in an assault boat in the neighborhood of Kolodno. My command staff, consisting of 2 armored wireless trucks, a number of cross-country vehicles, and some motorcyclists, followed at 0800 hours. I began by following the tank tracks of 18th Panzer Division, which soon reached the bridge over the Lesna, whose capture was important for the advance of the 52nd Panzer Corps. I found nobody except some Russian pickets. The Russians took to their heels when they saw my vehicles. 2 of my orderly officers sent off after them against my wishes. Unfortunately, they both lost their lives as a result. At 10:25 hours, the leading tank company reached the Lesna and crossed the bridge. Next to arrive was the divisional commander, General Nehring. I accompanied the 18th Panzer Division in their advance until mid-afternoon. At 1600 hours, I returned to the bridgehead at Kolodno, and from there I went to 1830 hours to my command post. We had managed to take the enemy by surprise along the entire Panzer Group front. To the south of Brest-Litovsk, the 24th Panzer Corps had captured the bridges over the Bug intact. To the northwest of the fortress, our bridges were being built according to plan. The enemy, however, had soon recovered from his initial surprise and put up a tough defense in his prepared positions. The important citadel of Brest-Litovsk held out with remarkable stubbornness for several days, thus depriving us of the use of the road and rail communications across the Bug and the Mukievek. In the evening, the Panzer Group was fighting around Maloriata, Kobrin, Brest-Litovsk, and Pruzana. At the last named place, the 18th Panzer Division became involved in the first tank battle of the campaign. On June 23rd, I drove the 52nd Panzer Corps at the village of Bildieki, some 14 miles northeast of Brest-Litovsk. I talked to General Lemelson and also spoke on the telephone to my headquarters in order to receive the latest information about the general situation. I went on to the 17th Panzer Division. The commander of the division's rifle brigade, General Ritter von Weber, described to me what his men were doing. At 0830 hours, I met General Nehring of the 18th Panzer Division and then returned to see General Lemelson once again. I next drove to Bruzana, where the headquarters of my Panzer Group was now to be located. On this day, the 54th Panzer Corps was fighting its way towards Sluzsk along the Kobrin-Borisa-Kartusa road. I gained the impression that the 52nd Panzer Corps was likely soon to be heavily engaged with Russian forces moving southeast from the direction of Bialystok, and I therefore resolved to spend the next day once again with this corps. On June 24th, I drove towards Slonim. The 17th Panzer Division had meanwhile arrived at this town. Between Rozana and Slonim, I ran into Russian infantry, which was laying down fire on the main road. A battery of the 17th Panzer Division and dismounted motorcyclists were returning the enemy fire without any particular success. I joined in this action, and by firing the machine gun in my armored command vehicle, succeeded in dislodging the enemy from his position. I was then able to drive on. At the headquarters of the 17th Panzer Division, at that time located on the western outskirts of Slonim, I found not only the divisional commander, General von Arnim, but also the corps commander, General Lemelson. I next visited the front line in Slonim, and then drove in a Panzer IV through no man's land to the 18th Panzer Division. At 1500 hours, I was back in Slonim, having ordered the 18th Panzer Division to push on in the direction of Bera Novish, while the 29th Motorized Infantry Division was instructed to hasten its advance towards Slonim. I then returned to my group command post. This drive took me unexpectedly through the middle of Russian infantry, which had come up in trucks to the very outskirts of Slonim and was on the point of dismounting. I ordered my driver, who was next to me, to go full speed ahead, and we drove straight through the Russians. They were so surprised by this unexpected encounter that they did not even have time to fire their guns. All the same, they must have recognized me because the Russian press later announced my death. I felt bound to inform them of their mistake by means of the German wireless. I rejoined my staff at 200 hours. I found messages waiting for me concerning fierce fighting on our deep right flank, where the 25th Army Corps had successfully been defeating Russian attacks on the Maloriata area since June 23rd. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. Fortunately, we were unaware that on this day, Hitler had become nervous for fear lest the strong Russian forces succeed in breaking out of our encirclement at some point. He wanted to halt the panzer groups and turn them against the Russians in and about Bialystok. On this occasion, however, the OKH proved strong enough to insist on adherence to the original plan and on the completion of the encirclement by a continuation of our advance to Minsk. Vilna was captured, as was Kovno. The Finns occupied the Åland Islands. The German 1st Mountain Corps seized the rich nickel area around Petsamo. Neither of these operations involved any fighting. Fresh enemy units, including tanks, had appeared on the 25th, driving from Bialystok to Slonim. The 29th Motorized Infantry Division arrived on the battlefield and took over the task of barring the Russians' advance on Slonim. Thus, the main strength of the 17th and 18th Panzer Divisions was free to continue the advance on Minsk. The latter division was already fighting its way towards Baranovichi. So basically, he kind of talks about how everything unraveled in the attack and kind of moving forward. The center group, right? There were three groups. So he kind of goes down. It's kind of boring about the cities they took, but I'm trying to skip forward where he had to go back and talk to Hitler and he had some encounter with his quack doctor too. Hitler offers Guderian to have the services of Hitler's quack doctor. It's all in the 6th chapter. It's just very different. Let's see. Hitler had forgotten that it was he himself who had ordered a rapid offensive with the objective Smolensk. During the past few days, he had concentrated his attention solely on the Bialystok encirclement. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch did not dare to express his own differing point of view to Army Group Center, since he knew that Hitler was opposed to it. So they head towards Smolensk, Bialystok, some of these other cities, cross the Dnieper, Dnieper. So they crossed over that. It's all very detailed, but really, I mean, I want to get to the part where Hitler's in here. Smolensk, Elnya, Roslav. They basically make it to the outskirts of Russia, but they are unable to take it. I forgot how long this chapter was. It's very long. But I mean, if you're into military history, it's very detailed. Let's see. Battle, fighting. Moscow or Kiev. The conference with Hitler took place in Novi Borisov at the headquarters of Army Group Center. Those present were Hitler and Schmundt, Field Marshal von Bock, Hoff, and myself, as well as a representative of the OKH, Colonel Heusinger, the chief of the operations department. We were each given the opportunity to express our views, and we did this alone, so no man knew what his predecessor might have said. But Field Marshal von Bock, Hoff, and I shared the opinion that a continuation of the offensive towards Moscow was of vital importance. Hoth reported that the earliest date by which his Panzer group could resume its advance was August 20th. The date I gave for my group was the 15th. Then Hitler assembled the whole company together and began himself to speak. He designated the industrial area about Leningrad as his primary objective. He had not yet decided whether Moscow or the Ukraine would come next. He seemed to incline towards the latter target for a number of reasons. First, Army Group South seemed to be laying the groundwork for a victory in that area. Secondly, he believed that the raw materials and agricultural produce of the Ukraine were necessary to Germany for the further prosecution of the war. And finally, he thought it essential that the Crimea, that Soviet aircraft carrier operating against the Romanian oil fields, be neutralized. He hoped to be in possession of Moscow and Kharkov by the time winter began. No decisions were reached on this day concerning those problems of strategy which we regarded as most important. The conference then began to discuss more detailed questions. The important point for my Panzer group was the decision not to evacuate the Elnya salient, since it was not yet known whether this salient might not still be needed as a jumping-off point for an attack towards Moscow. I stressed the fact that our tank engines had become very worn as a result of the appalling dust. In consequence, they must be replaced with all urgency if any more large-scale tank operations were to be carried out during the current year. It was also essential that replacements be provided for our tank casualties from current production. As for new tanks, we were not to get any, since Hitler intended to retain them all at home for the equipping of newly set up formations. In the ensuing argument, I stated that we could only cope with the Russians' great numerical superiority in tanks if our tank losses were rapidly made good again. Hitler then said, "If I had known that the figures for Russian tank strength which you gave in your book were in fact the true ones, I would not, I believe, ever have started this war." He is referring to my book, Achtung Panzer, published in 1937, in which I had estimated Russian tank strength at that time as 10,000. Both the chief of the Army General Staff Beck and the censor had disagreed with the statement. It had cost me a lot of trouble to get that figure printed, but I had been able to show that intelligence reports at the time spoke of 17,000 Russian tanks, and that my estimate was therefore, if anything, a very conservative one. To imitate the ostrich in political matters has never been a satisfactory method of avoiding danger. Yet this is what Hitler, as well as his more important political, economic, and even military advisors, chose to do over and over again. The consequences of this deliberate blindness in the face of hard facts were devastating, and it was we who now had to bear them. While flying back, I decided in any case to make the necessary preparations for an attack towards Moscow. Back at my headquarters, I learned that the 9th Army Corps, worried about a Russian breakthrough in the Yermolino area in the southeast edge of the encirclement, had withdrawn from the Moscow highway. So basically, he's headed towards Moscow. They kind of go on. The Battle of Roslavl happens. A significant indication of the attitude of the civilian population is provided by the fact that women came out from their villages on the very battlefield, bringing wooden platters of bread and butter and eggs, and in my case at least, refused to let me move on before I had eaten. Unfortunately, this friendly attitude toward the Germans lasted only so long as the more benevolent military administration was in control. The so-called Reich Commissars soon managed to alienate all sympathy from the Germans, and thus to prepare the ground for the horrors of partisan warfare. So that's it. I'm trying to get to where's Hitler and morale. He's talking. It's a lot of military stuff. I've forgotten some of this. Let's see. I went in to see Hitler. There were a great many people present, including Keitel, Jodl, Schmundt, and others, but neither Brautzich nor Halder, nor, indeed, any representative of the OKH. I described the state of my Panzer group, its present condition, and that of the terrain. When I had finished, Hitler asked, "In view of their past performance, do you consider that your troops are capable of making another great effort?" I replied, "If the troops are given a major objective, the importance of which is apparent to every soldier, yes." Hitler then said, "You mean, of course, Moscow." I answered, "Yes. Since you have broached the subject, let me give you the reasons for my opinions." Hitler agreed, and I therefore explained basically and in detail all the points that favored a continuation of the advance on Moscow, and that spoke against the Kiev operation. I maintained that, from a military point of view, the only question was that of finally defeating the enemy forces which had suffered so heavily in recent battles. I described to him the geographical significance of Moscow, which was quite different from that of, say, Paris. Moscow was the great Russian road, rail, and communication center. It was the political solar plexus. It was an important industrial area, and its capture would not only have an enormous psychological effect on the Russian people, but on the whole of the rest of the world as well. I dwelt on the attitude of the soldiers. They expected nothing but an advance on Moscow, and had already made the necessary preparations for such an advance with the greatest enthusiasm. I tried to show how a victory in this decisive direction and the consequent destruction of the enemy's main forces would make the capture of the Ukrainian industrial area an easier undertaking. Once we had seized the communication hub of Moscow, the Russians would have extraordinary difficulty in moving troops from north to south. I pointed out that the troops of Army Group Center were now poised for an advance on Moscow, that before they could start on the alternative operation towards Kiev, a great deal of time would be wasted in moving to the southwest, that such a move was towards Germany, i.e., the wrong direction, and that for the subsequent attack on Moscow, the troops would have to retrace their steps from Lokhvitsa to Roslavl, that is to say, 275 miles, with consequent heavy wear onto their strength and to their equipment. I described the condition of the roads over which my group would have to move, giving as example the ones I knew as far as Unitcha, and the unending supply problems which would have become greater with every day's march towards the Ukraine. Finally, I touched on the enormous difficulties which must arise if the proposed operation were not terminated as fast as was now planned and were to be protracted into the period of bad weather. It would then be too late to strike the final blow for Moscow this year. I ended with the plea that all other considerations, no matter how important they might seem, be subordinated to the one vital necessity, the primary achievement of a military decision. Once that was secured, everything else would be ours for the taking. Hitler let me speak to the end without once interrupting me. He then began to talk and described in detail the considerations which had led him to make a different decision. He said that the raw materials and agriculture of the Ukraine were vitally necessary for the future prosecution of the war. He spoke once again of the need of neutralizing the Crimea, that Soviet aircraft carrier, for attacking the Romanian oil fields. For the first time, I heard him use the phrase, "My generals know nothing about the economic aspects of war." Hitler's words all led up to this. He had given strict orders that the attack on Kiev was to be the immediate strategic object, and all the actions were to be carried out with that in mind. See present day stuff. Here I saw that the first time a spectacle for which I was later to become very familiar. All those present nodded in agreement with every sentence that Hitler uttered, while I was left alone with my point of view. Undoubtedly, he had already held forth many times on the subject of his reasons that had led him to take his strange decision. I was extremely sorry that neither Field Marshal von Brauchitsch or Colonel General Halder had accompanied me to this conference, on the outcome of which, according to them, so very much depended, perhaps even the result of the war as a whole. In the view of OKW's unanimous opposition to my remarks, I avoided all further arguments on that occasion. I did not then think it would be right to make an angry scene with the head of the German state when he was surrounded by his advisors. Since the decision to attack the Ukraine had now been confirmed, I did my best at least to ensure that it be carried out as well as possible. I therefore begged Hitler not to split my Panzer group as was intended, but to commit the whole group to the operation. Thus, a rapid victory might be won before the autumn rains came. Those rains would turn the trackless countryside into a morass, and the movement of motorized formations would be paralyzed. This request of mine was granted. It was long after midnight by the time I reached my quarters. On the same date, the 23rd of August, the OKH issued an order to Army Group Center which contained the following, quote, "The object is to destroy as much of the strength of the Russian Fifth Army as possible and open the Dnieper crossings for Army Group South with maximum speed. For this purpose, a strong force, preferably commanded by Colonel General Guderian, is to move forward with its right wing directed on Chernigov." I was not informed of this order prior to my conversation with Hitler. Colonel General Halder had not taken the opportunity to tell me about it during the course of the day. On the morning of the 24th, I visited the chief of the Army General Staff and told him of the failure of this last attempt to persuade Hitler to change his mind. I did not think of what I had to say would come as a surprise to Halder, yet to my amazement, he suffered a complete nervous collapse, which led him to make accusations and imputations which were utterly unjustified. On August 24th, the 24th Panzer Corps captured Novosibkov and threw the enemy back in the area of Unecha Starodub in the Battle of Kiev. So they go to Kiev. He details the Battle of Kiev. Where's the other Hitler thing? I'm trying to find the morale quote. But it turns out to be a disaster, right? They get stalled outside of Moscow in 41 and basically just start losing, maybe because he went and got Kiev. They had a choice to get Moscow. They didn't. Hitler made the decision. So Guderian says that's like, a huge thing. On September 26th, the Battle of Kiev was brought to a successful conclusion. The Russians surrendered. 665,000 men were taken prisoner. The commander-in-chief, Southwest Front, and his chief of staff fell in the last phase of the battle while attempting to break out. The commander of the Fifth Army was among the prisoners captured. I had an interesting conversation with this officer, to whom I put a number of questions. When did you learn that my tanks had penetrated behind you? Answer, about the 8th of September. Why did you not evacuate Kiev at once? Answer, we had received orders from the Army Group to evacuate the area and withdraw eastwards, and had already begun to do so when we received contrary orders to turn about and defend Kiev in all circumstances. The Battle of Kiev was undoubtedly a great tactical victory, but whether great strategic advantages were to be garnered from this tactical success remained questionable. It all depended on this. Would the German army, before the onset of winter, and indeed before the autumnal mud set in, still be capable of achieving decisive results? It is true that the planned assault on Leningrad had already had to be abandoned in favor of a tight investment. But the OKH believed that the enemy was no longer capable of creating a firm defensive front or of offering serious resistance in the area of Army Group South. The OKH wanted this army group to capture the Donets Basin and reach the River Don before winter. The main blow was to be dealt by the reinforced Army Group Center with objective Moscow. Was there still sufficient time for this to succeed? So he kind of goes in detail. September, October, right? The invasion was June 22nd. And there's a lot of military maneuvers day by day, very detailed, I think. But they get all the way out. They talk about the mud. Mud slows them down, the rain. And then the winter kind of comes in. Advanced to Tula and Moscow. He gets removed after he doesn't get into Moscow. He gets removed from his command. Guderian does. As an indication of the attitude of the Russian population, I should like to quote a remark that was made to me by an old Tsarist general who I had met in Orel at this time. He said, "If you only had come 20 years ago, we should have welcomed you with open arms, but now it's too late. We were just beginning to get on our feet, and now you arrive and throw us back 20 years so that we will have to start from the beginning all over again. Now we are fighting for Russia, and in that cause we are all united." They didn't really quite get that. They thought there was going to be a political collapse. The 21st of November, he writes to somebody, let's see. So the winter begins to set in. They're out on the outskirts of Moscow. And just like massive amounts of casualties and people injured. Our attack on Moscow had broken down. All the sacrifices and endurance of our brave troops had been in vain. We had suffered a grievous defeat, which was to be seriously aggravated during the next few weeks, thanks to the rigidity of our Supreme Command. Despite all our reports that those men far away in East Prussia could form no true concept of the real conditions of the winter war in which their soldiers were now engaged. This ignorance led to repeatedly exorbitant demands being made on the fighting troops. The war now was total enough for anyone. The economic and military potential of the greater part of the globe was united against Germany and Germany's feeble allies. So they kind of knew that they were in trouble in 41. It was kind of a matter of time. My first dismissal. Little monk, you are taking a hard road. These words of Frundsberg to Dr. Martin Luther before the Diet of Worms in 1521 were quoted to me by my comrades when they learned of my decision to fly to Hitler's headquarters. They were applicable enough. I was perfectly well aware that it would not be easy for me to bring Hitler over to my way of thinking. At that time, however, I still believed that our Supreme Command would listen to sensible propositions when they were laid before it by a general who knew the front. This belief I retained while making the long flight from the icebound battle area north of Orel to the well-appointed and well-heated Supreme Headquarters far away in East Prussia. I was to confer with Hitler for 5 hours, with only 2 breaks of half an hour each, one for the evening meal and one for the general weekly briefing, which Hitler always attended personally. I was received by Hitler about 1800 hours. Keitel, Schmundt, and other officers of Hitler's entourage were there also. Neither the Chief of Army General Staff nor any other representative of the OKH was present, though Hitler had appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Army after the dismissal of Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. And so, as on the 23rd of August, 1941, I stood in lonely opposition to the ranks of the OKW. As Hitler came forward to greet me, I saw to my surprise, for the first time, a hard, unfriendly expression in his eyes, and this convinced me that some opponent of mine must have turned him against me. The dim lighting of the room served to increase this unpleasant impression. The conference began with my description of the state of the 2nd Panzer Army and 2nd Army. I then spoke of my intention of withdrawing both armies bit by bit to the Susha-Oka position, an intention which, as already stated, I had expressed to Field Marshal von Brauchitsch on December 14th in Roslavel, and which he had approved. I was convinced that Hitler must have been informed of this. I was, therefore, all the more taken aback when he shouted, "No, I forbid that." I informed him that the withdrawal was already in progress and that there was no intermediate line at which it could be halted for any length of time before the rivers were reached. If he regarded it as important to preserve the lives of the troops and to hold a position throughout the winter, he had no choice but to permit the withdrawal to be completed. Hitler said, "If it is the case that they must dig into the ground where they are and hold every square yard of land." Guderian, digging into the ground is no longer feasible in most places since it is frozen to a depth of 5 feet, and our wretched entrenching tools won't go through it. Hitler, in that case, they must blast craters with the heavy howitzers. We had to do that in the First World War in Flanders. Guderian, in the First World War, our divisions in Flanders held, on the average, sectors 2 to 3 miles wide, and were supported by in the defense by 2 or 3 battalions of heavy howitzers per division, with proportionately abundant supplies of ammunition. My divisions have to defend fronts of 25 to 35 miles, and in each of my divisions there are 4 heavy howitzers, with approximately 50 shells per gun. If I use those shells to make craters, I shall have 50 hollows in the ground, each about the width and depth of a wash tub, with a large black circle around it. I shall not have a crater position. In Flanders, there was never such cold as we are now experiencing. And apart from that, I need my ammunition to fire at the Russians. We can't even drive stakes into the ground for carrying our telephone wires. To make a hole for the stake, we have to use high explosives. When are we going to get sufficient explosive to blast out defensive positions on the scale you have in mind? But Hitler insisted on his order that we remain where we were being carried out. Guderian, then this means taking up positional warfare in an unsuitable terrain, as happened on the Western Front during the First World War. In this case, we shall have the same battles of materiel and the same enormous casualties as then, without any hope of winning a decisive victory. If such tactics are adopted, we shall, during the course of this coming winter, sacrifice the lives of our officers, our non-commissioned officers, and of the men suitable to replace them. And this sacrifice will have not been only useless, but also irreparable. Hitler, do you think Frederick the Great's grenadiers were anxious to die? They wanted to live too, but the king was right in asking them to sacrifice themselves. I believe that I, too, am entitled to ask my German soldier to lay down his life. Guderian, every German soldier knows that in wartime he must risk his life for his country, and our soldiers have certainly proved up to now that they are prepared to do so. But such a sacrifice may only be asked of a man if the results to be obtained from it are worth having. The intentions I have heard expressed will lead to losses that are utterly disproportionate to the results that will be achieved. My soldiers will not have protection against the weather and the Russians until they reach the Susha-Oka line and the fortified positions that were built there during the autumn. I beg you to remember that it is not the enemy who is causing us our bloody losses. We are suffering twice as many casualties from the cold as from the fire of the Russians. Any man who has seen the hospitals filled with frostbite cases must realize what that means. Hitler, I know that you have not spared yourself and that you have spent a great deal of time with the troops. I grant you that, but you are seeing events at too close a range. You have been too deeply impressed by the suffering of the soldiers. You feel too much pity for them. You should stand back more. Believe me, things appear clearer when examined at a longer range. Guderian, naturally it is my duty to lessen the suffering of my soldiers so far as that lies within my power. But it is hard when the men have even now not yet received their winter clothing, and the greater part of the infantry are still going about in denim uniforms. Boots, vests, gloves, woolen helmets are either non-existent or else are hopelessly worn out. Hitler shouted, "That is not true. The quartermaster general informed me that winter clothing has been issued." Guderian, I dare say it has been issued, but it has never arrived. I have made it my business to find out what has happened to it. At present, it is in Warsaw Station, where it has been for the last several weeks, since it cannot be sent on owing to a lack of locomotives and obstructions to the lines. Our requests that it be forwarded in September and October were bluntly refused. Now it's too late. The quartermaster general was sent for, and I had to admit that what I had said was correct. Goebbels' campaign that Christmas for clothes for the soldiers was a result of this conversation. The clothes thus collected did not actually reach the soldiers during the winter of 41 or 42. Hitler now insisted that the number of supply troops and soldiers in the unit supply columns, which he considered far too great, be drastically cut down to provide more rifles for the front. Needless to say, this had been done to the greatest possible extent that was consistent with our not endangering our supply services. Further reduction was only feasible if the condition of other supply means, and particularly the railroads, was improved. It was difficult to make Hitler grasp this simple fact. So they talked about shelter. They described interests at the front. He's having an evening meal with Hitler. My conversation with Hitler was thus a complete failure. As I left the conference room, I heard Hitler say to Keitel, "I haven't convinced that man. The breach was now complete and can no longer be closed." The next morning, before starting the flight back, I telephoned General Jodl, the chief of the Armed Forces Command Staff, and repeated to him that present methods must lead to intolerable sacrifices of life for which there could be no possible justification. Reserves were needed urgently to occupy positions behind the front and out of contact with the enemy. This call of mine had no recognizable effect. I flew back to Orel. By Hitler's orders, the left-hand boundary of my army was changed to the junction of the rivers Shisdra and Oka. This alteration increased the responsibilities of my Panzer army to an undesirable extent. So it goes in detail, December 25th. So that's it. So he gets dismissed. On December 25th, I said farewell to my staff and issued a short order for the day of my troops. On December 27th, I left the front, and on New Year's Eve, I arrived in Berlin. So he leaves a formal order to his people, and that's basically it. That's basically the end of the thing. Like, he gets rejected, Hitler overwhelms him, and the whole thing ends in disaster. Like, people, just total deaths and destruction on the way back. The Soviets were vengeful and made it all the way back to Berlin, and horrible things happened even after the war. Like, we say the war ended in 45, but horrible things happened after that. So that was Heinz Guderian's Panzerleader campaign in Russia, which went south. And it's important to think about that in context. And when you have, I should probably read from this about Guderian's take on the attempted assassination of Hitler, because it's interesting too. But thank you very much for listening.